welcome everybody to Kim Sheridan's Capstone Defense. We're very happy to be here to welcome you in person and everybody else virtually to this event. Thank you everyone, such a nice crowd to turn out in the gallery. You'll get a chance to answer questions or ask questions. You get to answer the question.
Perfect.
So the way this works is you'll have 25 minutes to present your research and your capstone work. At the end of that time, we'll go into a question period. The question period it will comprise 2 rounds. First round is going to be initiated by your supervisor, then your second reader, and then I might have a question depending on whether I pick up on things during the presentation. After that, we go to the gallery. So we ask the crowd for questions or comments, and then we go for a second round. And then we'll go in the order of your supervisor and your second reader again. After that, we'll pause. Terry, well, I guess you'll probably just leave the room.
Okay.
And then Terry and I and Brad will go into a kind of closed session. We'll discuss your presentation as well as your written research assignment, the thesis itself. And we will come up with a score. We'll call you back in and hopefully it will be good news. So, yeah, without further ado, it's 9:40. We're getting rolling a little later than we expected because of some technical issues. If we start you at say 9:41, so that gives you until 06.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Guess we're ready.
There was yours.
I guess I'll look at you guys.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. I saw a few faces, friendly faces, so I really appreciate you joining me in this conversation. My topic is on advancing reconciliation in Canadian public relations. So I'll give you a quick overview of what's ahead. I got some amazing feedback from an elder, Liz Moses, talking about this topic and wanting to do it justice today. And she encouraged me to be simple in the information that I was sharing because, and I'm glad that there's extra people on the call because it's such a complex topic. And there's such a huge importance in raising awareness and having the opportunity for others to find their place in reconciliation. So while my paper was a bit more in depth, what follows is definitely high level to inspire people. I also shared a one-pager in the attached, which has an overview of just the learnings that have come up in this journey, which has been a year and a bit, for my fellow colleagues and peers to look at, and we can chat about it. And it's really a start to a bigger kind of conversation that moves into action. And that's very important that the conversation moves into action. So those are kind of the highlights of kind of the conversation I'm hoping to have with you all today, obviously one-sided for about 25 minutes, but so I'll do an introduction and background, a literature review, overview, talk about my research questions, my methodology, my results, show me discussion points, conclusion, and limitation, future research, and knowledge mobilization. So this quote, although when I started my journey in understanding reconciliation, I hadn't come across it, but I came across it recently. And it was a question that's actually posed to me in my former role about how I could indigenize my role within higher education and marketing and communications. And that was a question that was beyond my scope of knowledge at the time. And this paper and presentation endeavors to start to answer that question. And what I realize is that the journey ebbs and flows and is not linear. But for me, there is a passion of always going forward and understanding and continuous understanding. And also I've had the privilege of working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members, organizations, governments themselves, and seeing the work that's being done. And I've really been inspired and passionate about the work that's been done and wanting to find a way to contribute. And I really believe that our profession has great potential in contributing. And that's part of what this presentation hopefully will convince you of. So I talked about reading the TRC calls to action. There are various resources that are lengthy and maybe overwhelming. This is kind of a highlighted version of Call to Action 92, which is aimed at the business sector, but it also underscores the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People and adoption of a reconciliation framework. And this is where I guess the light bulb went on, if you will, and looking at public relations and their role in reconciliation. So respectful relationships, meaningful consultation, free and prior informed consent. The topic, and my supervisor can attest to this, was so broad, and I was really wanting to do it justice, and I really needed to focus on, 3 key areas that I felt I could start to answer the question. And so that's why I focused in on the call to action. It is 92. It is actually broader than that, and it does have potential for this area to explore, but not in the time frame that I allowed myself. So, oh no, we'll ignore that that's there. In my literature review, I explored the TRC calls to action. And again, we just talked about respectful relationships, meaningful consultation, and free and prior informed consent. Then I looked at strategic public relations management and governance, and the kind of the intertwining of the two, and the basis in which forms advancing reconciliation. And so you can see here dialogue, relationships. Relationships are a key part of bridging an enterprise strategy, and collaboration and ethics. And to further illustrate that point and get off that slide, I broke out what I feel is the connection between respectful relationships, meaningful consultation, and free and prior informed consent. So here we're seeing dialogue, and we're seeing working together with goodwill and commitment, upholding Indigenous values, worldviews, rights, and equality, shared understanding, objectives, goals, priorities, and decisions, and forming new understandings and partnerships. So across these 3 areas in my literature review, these qualities or attributes were woven throughout. And what I started to realize is that you can't have one without the other. And so they're interconnected, which was very intriguing. And then when I started to dig into strategic public relations management, I actually had a call with McMaster's Institute of Indigenous Research. I probably did not get that correct, but what is where I'm getting to. And there was a mention of, what about governance and governance role in reconciliation. And so it was very interesting when I started to dive deeper, and when I looked at, really what governance could be. It's collaborative, and it's very much akin to bridging an enterprise strategy, which is really bringing an organizational public relations, bringing the public's voices into the organization, and how that with dialogue and ethics, helps equalize power. And I saw this quote about dialogue being an instrument that moves reconciliation along. So again, in these 3 areas of dialogue, collaboration, bridging, enterprise strategy, and ethics, you can see that there's mirroring themes of, listening and dialogue, and it's built on openness and trust. And a key to kind of all of these areas in dialogue, it's consensus building, mutual understanding, collaboration that facilitates action. And again, this is where we redefine and create new spaces for partnerships and systems and ways of knowing and doing that are more inclusive and representative of Indigenous values and rights. So my research questions. So again, I really wanted to see how the Canadian public relations professional and profession could advance reconciliation. So I looked at respectful relationships, meaningful consultation, and free and prior informed consent. So in my methodology, I decided, given kind of my knowledge and comfort level and wanting to learn and grow and really understand reconciliation, that a thematic analysis of reconciliation action plans, published reconciliation action plans would make sense for me and give me a chance to really dive into the content and understand potential applications of respectful relationships, meaningful consultation, and free and prior informed consent. So I looked across the sectors, and for good or for bad, the natural resource sector has played a pretty heavy role in involvement in reconciliation to varying degrees. And wonderfully, they published a lot of plans to articulate their commitments and actions. And this is not to measure those actions or validate them. This is merely to investigate the language and the commitments and actions that they've stated. So reading through them, there were 6 in total, from forestry, oil and gas, energy. Interestingly enough, there were kind of governing bodies and First Nations governing bodies, which initiated their own reconciliation plans and working with partners, which is fantastic to see. So a lot of this learning will encapsulate both an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous perspective. So reading through those, step 1, getting familiar with the data and what were kind of the general themes that were starting to occur, and making connections into my literature review. And so I created a table of reference from a literature review, which was sort of a matrix of the different qualities and attributes of the 3 areas, and then intertwined strategic public relations management and governance. And then I used that to start identifying, categorizing the text, and making kind of areas which I could check or cross-reference. And then through that came theme searches, which we'll talk about in the results section, and then a review of the themes that were identified, and then capturing them in, I guess, digestible formats, and connecting them to theory and reporting on them. The result. Respectful relationships. So I've hinted to this throughout the presentation. So what came through here is that all of the reconciliation action plans, or RAP plans, as I'll go forward calling them, it's not as much to say, dialogic engagement. So, you know, that 2-way conversation that holds a willingness to change and interact beyond kind of the levels that you're used to. And those relationships need to be a mutual benefit. You know, agendas, predetermined agendas can exist, but they have to be met with consensus building. And a big key that I've learned, and personally, and it was nice to see in the RAP plans, is that business, going beyond business and connecting in community and relationships. And if you look at the relationships you hold and the different types of relationships you hold, you're invested them in more than one facet. And so looking beyond kind of the regular day-to-day business and, you know, being part of the overall community and showing up is key to building those relationships, and also understanding Indigenous values. And it's important to note that part of the complexity in building respectful relationships is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The relationships that we develop are can be specific to an individual, a nation, or a geographical area. So what's key is to remember that to eliminate the complexity is really to get to know the people's land in which you are operating on, and build your a knowledge base to help change your perspective and understanding. Meaningful consultation. I think this is again, without respectful relationships and dialogue, you can't have meaningful consultation. And meaningful consultation actually means a change where things are co-defined and shared priorities are identified. So an engagement, it's enduring, it's those pieces of dialogue, it's, you know, having those conversations and those connections where the end result is really connected to meaningful participation for both participants. Shared governance. So in those conversations, ideas, new perspectives, new ways of doing and knowing are going to be developed, and that governance and how you operate in the future comes from that and through that actual conversation. And then Indigenous representation and inclusion. And this really seems like a no-brainer, but it means throughout the process and from the beginning. So there's this quote, no decision about us without us. And so it's really encouraging people in the comms role to think about the decisions you're making and diving deeper. You know, we're always considering risks and managements and consequences, and but you know, and I think by viewing Indigenous involvement as not stakeholders but as partners will change the scape and really ensure that there's representation and inclusion in all the work that you're doing. Free, prior, and informed consent, very technical legal term, but has so much, adds so much clarity to inviting Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and honoring the UNDRIP in terms of Indigenous rights and self-determination. So again, it's interweaving decision-making where it's shared, and the duty to consult means that it's building consensus and shared agreement and connection. And again, that weaving of Indigenous knowledge and worldviews. So honoring that, you know, recognizing where your point of views and your perspectives are, and being open and willing to shift your mindset to understand others' perspectives and improve the relationship. The discussion. So advancing reconciliation in Canadian public relations. So through kind of my analysis and my results, various themes were coming to me, and they needed a way to further kind of map it out, I guess, if you will. And I chose to look at a tree trunk, or the inside of a tree trunk, because that, you know, demonstrates continued growth. And I really think our path to reconciliation is about continued growth. And I felt that dialogue, as I said before, is an instrument for reconciliation and change, and that's at the center and it's ongoing. And you know, the attributes of dialogue and what that means is kind of described within. And then you can see that through dialogue, you reach collaboration. So you're having collective problem solving, shared goals and objectives formed. You know, your orientation is towards the other, and so often it's towards ourselves or our business objectives, which might not be reflective of the perspective of the Indigenous nation or peoples that you're working with. And creation of space and spaces, so important. And I think that in our role, we hold a lot of space for business objectives and our perspectives and maybe westernized perspectives. And there's identifying a space in between where you can come together and share knowledge. Mutual benefit and understanding and participation. And then through that comes action. And so this is when things become joint. So you see that there's co-management and ownership, new systems and processes are in place, there's shared Indigenous stewardship is supported, and you start to see organizational and societal change. So next is limitations, future directions, knowledge mobilization. So there's this quote in the TRC that talks about the way we govern ourselves, the way we communicate, way we do business must change. And a lot of this to me directly related to the work that I've been doing and looking at strategic public relations involvement and reconciliation. We hold, I guess, the keys to the car in a lot of these places, and not to say that it's on the profession alone, but I think that the profession definitely is adept to support as strategic in its strategic capacity in supporting the organization to move things forward and change. And so this quote really spoke to me, and I thought it was important to highlight. So limitations, future directions, and knowledge mobilization. So Well, reconciliation action plans are in abundance in the last 2 or 3 years. They are still in their infancy, and a lot of the work that's been done was done very quick. And so that's why I actually chose the natural resource sector. And so looking at this in years to come, definitely could reap more benefits in terms of understanding reconciliation and the application for the profession. Limited reconciliation resources and research. There's not a lot of scholarship out there on reconciliation in business. There's some articles. It requires a lot of digging and research. There is some great work on governance and obviously organizational public relations relationships, but not directly to reconciliation in business in Canada. And so I'm hoping that, you know, this makes some sort of contribution either to debunk or expand on any of the areas. And in terms of future directions, the Yukon context presents quite an in-depth opportunity to look at reconciliation in business due to the 11 self-governing First Nations and their partnerships with businesses. And the elder that I had mentioned before is really keen to have a discussion and for me to learn more about that angle of what the Yukon context is. And so there's an opportunity for future research there and working with Yukon businesses to understand their relationships. And then also exploring PR and other calls. There's the health sector, there's education, and, you know, there's communications professionals in abundance in those areas, and looking at those calls to action that are specific to, say, health or education and public relations ability to support reconciliation is another area. Holding space for discussions, and this is kind of on me, and it's kind of already started in my new role of talking through our actions in the Yukon territory as part of the government, and kind of challenging kind of the ways that we've been doing things, and looking to be more inclusive, not only in the language that we use, but how we build those partnerships and create future resources for people. And then sharing knowledge and learnings. I would love to further this and share in any sort of kind of roundtable discussion. I did initially think about inviting a kind of a panel of various people that I've come across to kind of bring the conversation to life. I think that there's a lot that has been written in general about reconciliation, and I think when there's such breadth and depth, it can become overwhelming. So finding those opportunities for engagement, that's more of a conversation, and that spurs action and gives people the opportunity to ask questions is really important. I will look to kind of refine my work and possibly publish it in some realm, whether online as a blog or something. I've been invited to present my findings with my employer. And yeah, so that's kind of where I see knowledge mobilization going. And then I just added this slide, which is actually on the handout, of just kind of resources. And so a big part of understanding reconciliation and being able to support it is diving into kind of the various elements in the history and building your knowledge bank, if you will. So the University of Alberta has an amazing Indigenous Canada course that you can take. There's a smaller version of the Truth and Reconciliation booklet, and so that's where I encourage you to read it and see if you can find your place within it. It's much smaller, it's easy to digest. And then just kind of, you know, even style guides, Pathways to Reconciliation book was amazing and a great resource in understanding applications to implementing the calls to action. There's also the Business Reconciliation in Canada guidebook, which is a great resource as well. But again, what's missing, I think, is a toolkit for public relations professionals in Canada. There's lots of courses that pertain to kind of the history, but there's not a lot of conversation about moving beyond that in the action part of it. And I think that's a real miss. And I think sometimes because of the complexity of understanding the history, which is important, that it might deter people from continuing their journey, because it took me a very long time to wrap my head around the subject. And so looking for simple ways to raise the awareness and also for people to see themselves in reconciliation, I think is really key. And I think that's, while these resources are a great start, there definitely could be more detail and more support. So that concludes my presentation today.
You're well ahead of time.
Yes.
So great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we'll move on to questions. So we'll start with your supervisor, Professor Horn.
I'm just gonna
Oh, we gotta
share.
Unmute him.
Unmute, yeah, and if we could stop the share so I could potentially see everyone a little better.
Yep. Stop your share.
I'll stop my share. You're talking to me, right?
Yeah.
Great,
There we go. And then just-
excellent. All right, well,
Yeah. See everybody?
yeah, perfect. Kim, first and foremost, thank you for your continued dedication. And what is really impressive to me about your journey in this space is the willingness to continue to try to create pathways where they don't exist. And so as we've talked about through this journey, when you start trying to find what are the intersections between reconciliation and public relations, there really are few. And so what I see out of your work is a very clear, helpful tool to practitioners, to organizations, to think about the how to answer this call to action 92 charge that's corporate sector in Canada should adopt, right? So one of the biggest challenges that we face in PR is thinking about the how when things happen. So first and foremost, thank you for your dedication, for your thoughtfulness, and for your willingness to get through many drafts, many different directions to this point. I also want to thank your peers for joining today, because this is such an important topic. And I think that your work here will be very helpful for a variety of practitioners within how we view reconciliation and public relations. My opening comments and aside, I want to focus for you to try to help answer the question when it comes to both respectful relationships and the ethical components of the work here with this charge. What is the question that we should be incorporating into the ethical foundations of PR when it comes to reconciliation? If we talk about things like greatest good for the greatest number, or that it's a duty and obligation, foundationally, it would seem to answer the charge of reconciliation, we are challenged with changing the way we think. And you've created that in numerous forms here today. How does that transfer into the practice of public relations through an ethical sense?
Well, when you look at the PR's professional's role as the ethical counselor of an organization, there's a moral obligation and duty to uphold basic human rights. And the TRC's call to action is very much that, upholding Indigenous rights. And so bringing, the voices of the public in, and ensuring that the business activities are done with transparency, openness, and also looking at the values of the corporate culture. And, do they align with reconciliation? And because that role is often transmitting the values inwardly and outwardly, and maybe there's potential to challenge those values or reshape or reform them to improve the organization's, worldview of reconciliation, and also its impact on society. Short answer.
Excellent. No, well done to put you on the spot with that, to reflect that, because ultimately that's the question that we have to I would say we have to represent within the meaningful council space, is that's what the practice must do in order to ensure that this is actually considered. And I just have one kind of follow-up into that. Because this is a public governmental declaration about the private sector, as you went through this and as you thought about how to create your findings based off of your investigation, how do you anticipate that private sector implementation for a public or governmental expectation to go? Smooth, difficult. What I'm trying to ultimately get at is the validation of what you're hoping to achieve with this, of how it can benefit private practice when private practice is inherently different than the public and governmental sector expectation.
It's a great point. I think as the Edelman barometer keeps reinforcing as the societal role that business is taking on, and even eclipsing government, right? Public is looking to business to take action and make change. And to your question about how it will go, I think it depends on the organizational culture and their mission, and whether they're, forward thinking and outward facing. And, I think about Royal Bank of Canada and the challenges that are put towards them in financing companies that aren't, upholding, called Action 92 and impacting Indigenous people. And I think when I started to think about how companies could actually implement this, I really wanted it to create a decision tree, but it was too complex to think about it. But in deciding to take that journey, it's really understanding your relationship to Indigenous people. There's businesses that, yes, are on this land, but in the health sector and in education, there's, direct impacts and when you're using land and resources. And so I think those areas definitely need to dig deeper and understand their role. But again, it's not regulated, it's not mandated, except for the duty to consult. So it is very much of a challenge. And to the Yukon context, I think that may be biased, but also I think that because there are self-governing nations and who have, agreements set in stone, they're upheld. And so there's treaties. And so I think that it would kind of have to bounce back to that legal sphere a bit more, rather than, these aspirational documents. And the adoption of MDRIP is a good first call, but I think it requires more work in the business realm, and it might require legal. I can't believe I said that out loud, but I guess I was just random thinking, big Pandora's box to open there. But yeah, it really depends. And I think what's really key is checking the performative nature of advancing reconciliation, or publicizing your commitment, versus actually doing the internal work to make changes and incorporate Indigenous systems for finance, and in various aspects of your business, and how it relates to your business. So it's definitely complex work, very specific and individual to the organization and the people within it, and the culture within that organization, and for those inspired to make change.
Thank you.
Great, Dr. Flynn.
Congratulations. Thank you very much. This is a very important and meaningful addition to, I think, our research and our literature on how we as settlers and white businesses can begin to recognize the importance of collaboration with our Indigenous nations, our sisters and brothers in those communities as well. I wasn't planning on asking this question, but you raised the, RBC. And on my drive in this morning, I heard RBC just met its quarterly earnings of $3 billion and announced a 1% staff reduction at the same time. So how do organizations that are driven by quarterly short-term perspectives manage in a non-legal way? You sort of cringed at the notion of legal mandates to this. And in solving this issues when, they're more concerned about making sure that their shareholders are satisfied, because this is, at this point, there is no business case yet to be made for that.
There is actually business cases to be made for that. In Indigenous economic reconciliation, which I did not have the bandwidth to examine, but there is business cases, and I didn't explore it in depth, but in working more closely with Indigenous peoples on their land, and when you're doing extraction and various things, there can be financial outcomes in involving Indigenous people. But to your question, I thought about that, and I think I mentioned it in my paper, that it's a tall task, it's a tall order, and I think, and when businesses are tasked with the day-to-day business, it's a real challenge. I guess what I would say is that your customers are Indigenous people. You operate on Indigenous land. And I believe there's a reconciling that definitely needs to happen. And I think the thing that maybe doesn't keep me up at night is that it's a journey, and you start somewhere, and there's different resources of getting to know, providing training or opportunities to attend an Indigenous cultural event, and starting to form that relationship for your staff. But yeah, it does depend on the business and its business goals. But I guess what I would say is that the public and society is getting louder, and I guess it could be something you can't ignore, and it eventually will impact your business. And I think with larger organizations, and this happens so many times, you're so big, you think you will continue to be big, and there could be, something that comes along that maybe reconciles, the financial conflict with Indigenous people that, gain support, and you lose customers, and then you'll probably act, unfortunately.
And make no mistake, I'm not saying that there's not a business case.
Oh, yeah.
What I would suggest is that I don't have faith in businesses.
No.
To believe there is a case that long-term relationships, this in this particular instance, it's not only the right thing to do, but maybe it should be the legislative way to do things, right? That there is some kind of return that way. You looked only at the natural resource sector.
Yes.
Which is understandable, and probably, as you said rightly, that they are probably amongst the most advanced, because they are working on Indigenous lands as well. And some of them have done a really good job in terms of developing those relationships, and as opposed to banks, maybe have looked at longer term views, because the work that they do can't be done in a quarterly basis. But are there generally accepted principles now that you found from the resource sector that could easily be applied to other sectors? And given that, the grounded nature of this work, do you have a grounded theory that you have come up with?
What a question, Mr. Flynn. Dr. Flynn. Wow. That's a big question. What was reoccurring to me was not a theory, but a shift in mindset. And you talked about the settler privilege, and also that inclusivity of culture and recognizing culture, and upholding Indigenous rights. So those kind of areas, I felt, in whatever process that you are, I felt like they were kind of guiding pillars. To recognize your perspective and build your toolkit to be able to understand other perspectives, or at least invite them in. And so that willingness to change. I think so often I talk a lot about how you go into, say, a meeting, and you want to get an answer. And you think that's, just the way you operate, and you need this answer to move forward. And I think that what's scary is that you recognizing you don't have the answer, and to get to that answer is inviting different perspectives which haven't traditionally been done and you might not know how to do. And in my opportunity and living and working in the Yukon Territory is that many Indigenous community members have said, if you don't know, ask. And so I think that, we always want to have the answers. And I think what's really important, and I guess it's not a theory, but it would be to be curious and ask and look inside and kind of understand where you are. And I think it's also inherently personal. So it's super challenging for an overarching theory, but I think maybe there's some guiding thoughts and principles. And this research could go so many ways, and I'm so passionate about it, and finding something that really resonates and connects. And it's such a large, important topic. And I would love to figure out how to answer that question, Jared, but I'll give you the.
But I think you have already, this diagram that you've showed
Oh, yes.
is the basis for the theory of building that from the core out.
I was gonna say, did you see my diagram? But I felt I shouldn't and try to.
But people haven't, I'm gonna try to,
I shared it.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, but you share it with everybody, but to bring it up on a separate,
Okay.
that piece, and I would encourage everybody there just to look at the one pager that Kim has developed as well. And I really like this notion, and maybe graphically you can align it more to look like a tree trunk, but
I would,
at the
yes.
core of a tree is that center trunk. Right, and a tree will not grow unless the foundation is inherently strong.
Mhm.
And as you move out in this diagram, there are new, in fact, growth rings, right, that have to work
Yes.
together.
Yes.
And this is just even how you diagram this is different than usually when we look at these kind of diagrams where we move towards the center.
Yes.
And what you're saying is you move towards the outer rings.
Well, and there's
Right?
variations,
Yeah.
like where you're gonna go back and
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
And I did, and Brad can attest to this. I had grand ideals of the visuals that I would have in this presentation. And that my presentation was going to be entirely visuals. To tell the story, it just, it was a lot. But I did think that, and I tried my graphic design skills, and I realized that the rings were a little bit too distracting. So that's what you got here today. But it definitely could be refined and shared more. And I actually thought it could be a great kind of like 30-second explainer kind of video as well. Again, money, time, resources.
Good.
So Brad or Terry, do you have further questions?
Do you have any questions? Brad?
I'm just gonna give you a chance
Yeah,
to have
go
a
ahead,
second
Brad.
there.
My question is really out of this, Kim. What content would you say, what guidance can you think this investigation can return from your perspective to advise practitioners? I see one of the real benefits of this is beyond the organizational level, but individual practitioners. And I'm curious if you have thoughts there as to what you think. You mentioned you'd had the opportunity perhaps to speak with your own employer, but what are those content pieces, or what do you think can come next to help practitioners incorporate this theoretical framework?
I think I mentioned it. It's a toolkit. I came across a phenomenal toolkit from I'm blanking now what the actual name is, but Parks Canada. And it was talked about in all the literature that I came across. And it was really like the doing, and how to kind of form relationships. And again, it's just that baseline of, understanding the history, the context in which you exist with Indigenous peoples. But then it talks like it's so simple in terms of like their staffs begin work with this training, and their number one goal is just to learn about the land that they're on and form relationships and attend cultural ceremonies and research, and that's it. And then they start to form relationships, but not with a goal, just actual relationships to really understand, because then your perspective's changing and you're going to see an issue or a challenge differently. And I think in my old organization, they would, we would have a question pertaining to something related to indigenization of something, and they would say, talk to First Nation initiatives, and that always would bother me. And I said, well, we can't always talk to First Nation initiatives. We need to develop resources on our own so that we can have somewhat an understanding, and they're there to check or guide us. But we need to do the work, and the work is really challenging. And so part of, I guess, that is a toolkit, a manual, or a talk, or some sort of resource guide. I definitely, and Brad, I'm maybe feeling overly confident here, but I definitely did think it should be part of this program in more depth. I think the EDI piece is great, but that was more so in marketing, if I remember, but bringing it into kind of the core courses, and having an opportunity for and in my own little head, it would be that, an assignment or a personal reflection, your role in the organization, and what are the things that you need to know or think about, or, kind of like a journey or a reflection. I think that maybe even in was it Terry's journal reflections or something like that. And I think I was shocked to find that wasn't much in communications or publication, like academia, like programs. There's definitely the Indigenous Canada resource that I had showed, but again, that application and kind of moving beyond the information, while the information is so important and foundational, it's a lot and it can stop you in your tracks. And so it's coming up with those resources, and as Liz Moses said, simplifying and building that awareness and creating that connection to the work ahead. Did I answer that question, Brad?
Mhm.
You did, in good ways. So thank you, Kim. I appreciate the thoughtfulness.
Brad, your questions are really hard.
Hmm.
I thought
Oh,
you
now
would
you're
be the-
stepping up the game. Now
Oh.
I have to, thanks. That was a little too soon. Okay, so given that, I just want to build off what you said as well, because I think this is still a settler perspective. At the end of the day,
Yes, totally.
you are still a white woman who's looked at this through your own privilege lens.
Mhm.
What about checking, right? I mean, I want to use the term validate,
Yes.
but I don't think that's an appropriate word, because it's validating to what,
Yeah.
but to checking. And I get that, our Indigenous Research Center and all our Indigenous resources are overloaded,
Yeah.
right? Because we are coming to them and saying, help us fix this or
Yeah.
figure this out. But when we do come to this, then how do we check in to see whether or not what you have identified here has meaningful context adaptation results for our Indigenous communities?
100%.
But how do we do that?
100%. So part of my, I guess, great trepidation and such a heavy topic was connecting with, my community and talking about this work, because I have, and there's that fear. And so that just back to that being curious, I did start, as we got closer, to have conversations and begin to talk about the work that I've been doing and sharing the tree diagram with Indigenous members of our community and in academia, and not in any depth. But I think the work here to be done is to socialize it. And, I did get an invitation to meet with some elders, and I'd like to meet with some youth as well. And then also talk to businesses who are, in it, and see, is it applicable to the work that's being done, obviously in the Yukon context, but still relevant. It was just a tall order. And also I wanted to pass first before I started talking about this research in depth. But yeah, it definitely needs to be done, and it's important, and I would love to continue that part of it. And I think it's important work. Just not exactly knowing how or to do it.
Well, maybe the first opportunity is to circle back with the McMaster Institute for Indigenous Research Initiative, right?
Yeah,
So that as a way to say,
yes,
and it's in-house and it
Yes.
is safe and it's,
yes,
and they're the ones that kind of began to guide you as well in this.
definitely,
Yeah.
yes.
Great. So,
Yeah, so I actually had one quick question before we go to the gallery. So it's interesting. I've worked a lot with Indigenous communities.
Mhm.
I wrote a co-authored dictionary of Indigenous language.
How did I
Um,
not find that in my search?
And they're very practical in their outlook.
Mhm.
And actually, it's interesting because there's often a mismatch between the sort of rhetorical and what's the word? I almost want to say like moral language that non-Indigenous people use,
Mhm.
privilege, etc.
Mhm.
And the way Indigenous people approach questions, which is really a kind of about business development usually, right? Particularly when you're dealing on a kind of nation to nation basis, right? So I think a really interesting step would be to start to socialize it outside of academia. I mean, it's good to go to the
Mhm.
institute because
Yeah.
they like to talk theory the same as other academics, but be interesting to go beyond it and to actually speak to Indigenous business people, right?
Yeah.
And of which we have one in our community, one of our alums
Oh, good.
who now works for a lithium company
Interesting.
in the Northwest Territories. And others like that. And because I think that there's kind of two rhetorics happening. There's an academic kind of moral rhetoric, which has a particular political perspective. And then there's a business rhetoric on both Indigenous and the business side, which doesn't necessarily have that same moral and political point of view. It's much more utilitarian and practical. So, I mean, do you envision or see the possibilities to go and deal with, I'd say outside of the whole sort of governance and spokes perspective and talk to Indigenous businesses? Yeah.
Yes, yes. So that is also one of my thoughts is, and no disrespect or shade to academia, but also wondering if things would move along differently and be more inclusive if it was direct to business and working with businesses and maybe become a bit more relevant to the practice, like business practices. Locally, there's kind of a consulting body that looks at reconciliation and practices and helps businesses, and they actually developed some resources. And so one of my stops would be to talk to them about my research. So
Yeah.
really in that socializing, I was hoping to find after this where to take it. But I can definitely see that business side for sure.
You know, what will be really interesting would be to, if you were to ever turn this into some kind of consulting practice
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
to work, to have an Indigenous partner,
Mhm.
you know,
Yes.
in the practice. Who's a business person,
Yes.
and to work together, that could be really powerful
Yes,
and actually quite effective
yes.
in terms of, you know, finding clients.
Definitely. So that this company in the Yukon does do that. And so my idea would be to share that and see
Oh,
what
perfect.
type of relationship could happen. And they do many workshops and so there's many applications. And additionally, going back to kind of the academia, I feel like this could, the Yukon University has a Yukon First Nations 101, but it's very much about the historical context.
Yeah.
So I actually think that this could be the next complement because everyone that attends it is in business. So, you know, how do you create that kind of curriculum or course for that? And having an Indigenous partner would be amazing. So that's kind of a thought I've had as well.
That's
off
great.
the road.
Well, those are my questions. We'll quickly go to the gallery to see if anybody has a thought or a question or a comment.
I'm trying to see.
Any hands up, any comments?
oh yeah, Nicole Wall,
Oh, Nicole Wall, yeah. Terry's gonna give
you
you,
have to unmute. There you go.
Hello, hi Kim.
Hi.
That was really fascinating. I really appreciate this chance to sort of learn and unlearn things at the same time. It's really important. And I've already ordered one of the books that you mentioned on Amazon. So thank you. I have a question about sort of some of the pieces that you were just talking about with Alex. Have there been any moves in Canada or in other countries to increase the number of Indigenous students in public relations or communications management programs so that we have sort of this new generation coming up to better inform the kinds of decisions and collaborations that exist?
That's a fantastic question. I can only speak to from my experience of being part of higher ed and knowing that there are programs that hold spaces for Indigenous students. Specifically in communications, I didn't find much. I found University of Alberta had one communications class, which did like a small themed section on reconciliation with a few published papers, but I didn't find much. But to my astonishment, every time I Google reconciliation in higher ed, things are coming up like fast and furious and responding, but I didn't have a way to take a snapshot of public relations or comms studies to figure that out. But there's somebody in this program that can take a look at that. I don't know, but it's a great question, and I hope to see more.
Yeah, I think the only thing that is available right now is scholarships through the Canadian Public Relations Society Foundation.
Yeah.
That our work in anti-racism, the summit that we did, all the proceeds went to help establish that. I know that also Bruce McCullen was a great supporter of scholarships for Indigenous as well as Dantish. So I think there's some scholarships up, but I think it's a good thing that we should continue to pursue.
Yeah, I agree. In the APR, which is our national accreditation program, when we revised it 3 years ago, and it's up for another revision now, we introduced it for the first time an Indigenous reconciliation component, which was formally part of it. It used to be part of the extended reading list, and now it's part of the core curriculum of the APR. But it's an excellent question, Nicole, and because I think that communications capacity on Indigenous communities is really low. And I think that there's not a huge understanding of what public relations does. So quite often
or misunderstanding.
Sure, yeah, and often it's a job that's delegated to somebody who's doing something else as their main job. So you'll have somebody who's a receptionist somewhere who also happens to be communications officer for so they're not trained, they don't necessarily have an understanding of how to perform the task other than to pick up the phone or whatever, right? So there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of education, and it's a huge opportunity for growth for both sides, I think, of academia and for First Nations administrations, right? So yeah. Any other questions from the?
Great job, Kim.
Thank you.
Nope.
Seeing no questions, we will ask you to leave the room.
And we're gonna put everybody else in a breakout room.
Please.
And
So there's some comfortable chairs just outside.
Find the loop.
it's right beside you here.
Oh, perfect. Okay, you'll come get me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you just close your lid?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Close my lid.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.